is the only field where optimism is a requirement. As a general, as a poet, as a composer, as an economist, as a president, you can be a pessimist. As a writer. But as an architect, you cannot, because the virtue of building a foundation for something that is still to come makes you into someone who's looking forward towards the future. That's why I'm not nostalgic. People with nostalgia are people who don't believe in the future. There will be no future without our memory. So memory is the key, it's the underpinning. It's what's below the foundations. It's the earth you dig the foundations into. And memory is not a footnote. It's not also a vignette. It's a process of trying to orient oneself in the complex world that is always shifting. So memory is definitely the ground, as I see it, of any building, however modest or however representative. Unexpected turns on the path that took me to architecture. I wasn't planning to be an architect. In fact, I was into so many things. In drawing, in art, in music, in literature. I was a performing musician, a virtuoso. But all those things took me to architecture. I don't really know how. Maybe by a series of accidents. But I certainly became an architect only much later in my life, because I also realized that while most people my age apprentice themselves to other architects, came to practice architecture, learn what is architecture. I tried it for a day or two working for other architects, and then I quit. I said, this is not really what I think architecture is. So I forged a crazy path, a path where when I was in Berlin, when I won the competition museum, I remember my wife told me, she said, what are you going to do now? And I said, well, let's stay in Berlin. And she said to me, but I've never even been in an architect's office in my whole life. And I said, neither have I. So we're in the same boat. We can be partners. That was more than that times. I lived under a totalitarian government, under communism. We were Jews, and anti-Semitism was very pervasive. There was darkness all around. I lived in a void. We had no family left. And yet, my parents, and you have to talk about your parents, my mother, my father, were not just victims. They had their own personalities. They were survivors in the true sense of outliving their murderers, their attempted murderers. So they had a sense of being. And I think I acquired by kind of osmosis, not by any direct conversation, the sense that the most important thing in your life is liberty. Is not to just be a follower. And there were a lot of fellow travelers in these times. It's easier to survive when you're fit into society. And I remember that sense of resistance against things that are not really for you. They're not freeing you. So perhaps that's a theme. Now that I reflect on it, just try to get some freedom. And architecture of all fields is probably the most regulated of all fields. As an artist, as a painter, as a musician, you can almost do anything. Jacques Derrida, the famed philosopher who was a friend of mine, said to me once, I as a philosopher, as a thinker, writer, I can get any small publisher, or even on the internet, I can just publish what I want to think. But you, Mr. Liebeskin, need a legal permission. You need some lawyer, some legal documents to be signed. And I thought a lot about it, because think about it, we are free in science. Science can pose questions. Art can pose questions. Literature, music. But from architects, we just expect the expected. We don't expect the unexpected. And it's really the profession that reinforces conformity and the illusion of a certain kind of world which we don't want to give up. So that always interested me, because art and architecture, in a way, interplay, or music and architecture. Music also, you have to be able to write a score. You have to be able to give it to others, if you're a composer, or even yourself, to be able to interpret it within a certain range of freedom, but also precision. So my background, whether it's in the arts or in music or even scientific, when I came to New York, I went to a very famous school here, high school called the Bronx High School of Science, where all the kids there were captured to catch up with the Russians in space technology. So the year of the Sputnik. And I was put in this advanced class, which I didn't really enjoy, but yeah, so you have to have all these kind of pieces. And at the end, somehow, I was lucky to navigate to a place which I came to without a goal. And I think that's important, because most business gurus tell you should have a goal. Follow your goal. It's not the materials of architecture that make architecture. It's not the stone and the glass and the steel structure that makes architecture for me. Architecture is the atmosphere, the story being told through light, through proportions, through all those elements. But it's something that communicates to you directly, to your soul. Look, music. I used to be a musician. You can see the musical instruments, the cello, the violin, the piano, but you can't see the music. So you can see the materials, you can see the walls, you can see the window, but you can't see the architecture. Architecture is the atmosphere, that story that has been created, and you're part of it. It's not the materials of architecture that make architecture. It's not the stone and the glass and the steel structure that makes architecture for me. Architecture is the atmosphere, the story being told through light, through proportions, through all those elements. But it's something that communicates to you directly, to your soul. Look, music. I used to be a musician. You can see the musical instruments, the cello, the violin, the piano, but you can't see the music. So you can see the materials, you can see the walls, you can see the window, but you can't see the architecture. Architecture is the atmosphere, that story that has been created, and you're part of it. This is the only field where optimism is a requirement. As a general, as a poet, as a composer, as an economist, as a president, you could be a pessimist. As a writer. But as an architect, you cannot, because the virtue of building a foundation for something that is still to come makes you into someone who's looking forward towards the future. That's why I'm not nostalgic. People with nostalgia are people who don't believe in the future. There would be no future without our memory. So memory is the key, it's the underpinning. It's what's below the foundations. It's the earth you dig the foundations into. And memory is not a footnote. It's not also a vignette. It's a process of trying to orient oneself in the complex world that is always shifting. So memory is definitely the ground, as I see it, of any building, however modest or however representative. It's a series of unexpected turns on a path that took me to architecture. I wasn't planning to be an architect. In fact, I was interested in so many things. In drawing, in art, in music, in literature. I was a performing musician, a virtuoso. But all those things took me to architecture. I don't really know how. Maybe by a series of accidents.
And considered solution that therefore speaks about how you're going to use it, not the terrible struggles that we as designers and engineers had in trying to solve some of the problems. That's quite obsessive, isn't it?
We now have a new generation of products where the form bears absolute absolutely no relation to the function. I mean, look at something like an iPhone and think of all the things it does. In the olden days of sort of what are called analog products, in other words, they're not digital, they're not electronic, something like, say, a chair or a spoon, form followed function tend to work. So if, say, you imagine being a Martian and you just land on planet Earth and you've never seen a spoon or a chair before, you can guess roughly what you're supposed to do with them, sit on or feed yourself with them, by the shape of the object, by the way it looks. Now, all that has been annihilated by the microchip. So design is moving from this culture of the tangible and the material to an increasingly intangible and immaterial culture. But that poses an enormous number of tensions and conflicts within design.
I think there are really three phases of modern design.
Industrial design has always been mass production. It's been producing standardized objects for consumption by millions and millions of people. One of the earliest examples would be the first emperor of China. He was waging war to try and colonize more and more parts of what would eventually become China, and one of his problems was that each of his archers made their own arrows, and so if, say, an archer died, a fellow archer couldn't grab the arrows from his quiver and start shooting at the enemy because the arrows literally didn't fit his bow. So the first emperor and his advisors came up with a way of standardizing the design of the arrows so that each arrow would fit any bow. Many of the best examples of industrial design are things that people don't think were designed at all. I mean, take the Post-it note. It's something we take for granted, but people don't think of it as being designed, and what they don't realise is that from the moment they wake up, almost everything that fills their world has been designed one way or another.
Is a story embedded in every object. Every decision was made at some point about something. This particular toothpick is like a Japanese toothpick, but obviously it's manufactured for sale in the US. But what's interesting about it is it's kind of the evolution of a type of object that happens over many, many years. But you'll notice that the end of it, the tip of it, is serrated, so you could break it off. This is like to signify that it was used, but it also creates a tiny rest for the toothpick. Obviously, a Japanese-style toothpick has a specific cultural context where that kind of functionality makes sense, and that kind of ritual, it makes sense. That may not be used that way at all in the United States. But what's fascinating about these little stories that get embedded in objects is that I'm reminded of a quote by Henry Ford, who once said, "Every object tells a story, if you know how to read it."
We work as consultants, which means we work with a lot of different companies in a lot of different fields. But really our common interest is in understanding people and what their needs are. So if you start to think, well, really what these guys do as consultants is focus on people, then it's easy to think about what's needed design-wise in the kitchen or in the hospital or in the car. We have clients come to us and say, here's our average customer. For instance, female, she's 34 years old, she has 2.3 kids, and we listen politely and say, well, that's great, but we don't care about that person. What we really need to do to design is look at the extremes. The weakest, or the person with arthritis, or the athlete, or the strongest, or the fastest person. Because if we understand what the extremes are, the middle will take care of itself. It's actually things I haven't seen in 1,000 years. We'll try to use this.
material. Like here's one that's hollow inside. You know, a good friend of mine, Sam Farber, he was vacationing with his wife Betsy. I got a phone call one night. He was so excited, he said he couldn't sleep. And what he was excited about is he had been cooking dinner with Betsy, and she was making an apple tart. And she was complaining about the peeler, that it was hurting her hands. And she had arthritis, and she just couldn't hang on to it. And it hit Sam at that moment that here's a product that nobody's really thought about.
And our thought was, well, if we can make it work for people with arthritis, it could be good for everybody.
And we knew that it had to be a bigger handle. You know, kids have big crayons because they're easier to hold on to. It's the same thing for somebody that might not have full mobility of their hand. They need something a little bit larger that's a little easier to grip with a little bit less force. So we did a lot of studies around the shape of the handle, the size of it, to come up with that size that would be perfect for everybody.
But eventually we found a rubberized bicycle grip, and we basically did this. So it really goes through many, many more iterations than you would think to do a handle that's relatively simple in the end.
One thing with a hand printer is you have this like constant friction happening, like when you're closing it.
But if you hold on to it, because I feel like here's the spot that really hurts. Like this is the biggest pressure point for me.
It's just like right in this area on all 4 fingers, friction. So when we start out doing a project, looking at these different tools to understand really how we can design a better experience for someone ergonomically. So really what we did here was just to map it out when we did the exercise with the glove and understanding where the pressure points are. And when we sort of go into this process of developing these models, some of the ideas. One thing we realized with this model, if you compare with other head share,
This is the only field where optimism is a requirement. You know, as a general, as a poet, as a composer, as an economist, as a president, you could be a pessimist. As a writer,